So now I would like uh, to move on to our panel discussion, so we can have discussion about this. And uh, in a panel, we will be rejoined by the state senator Andrew Gunardis, whom I have already introduced. Welcome back, Senator. And we are going to be joined by two special guests. One is Joe Toscano, who's an award-winning designer, publisher, author, entrepreneur, international keynote speaker. Joe has traveled the world speaking about the abuses of data in Silicon Valley. He has written a book called Automating Humanity, and he has started the Better Ethics and Consumer Outcomes Network, Beacon, all focused on increasing technology literacy and discovering opportunities for purpose-driven innovation and moving communities forward through purpose-driven innovation. Outside of Beacon, Joe also writes for Forbes and is a member of the World Economic Forum Steering Committee on Data Protection. And of course, he's famously featured in The Social Dilemma. You can watch his TED Talk that is called Want to Work for Google? You already do. You are producing something for Google, something of value. And the fourth or third person on the panel, and the fourth on your screen, is Tiffany Johnson, who is an ethical data advocate and a strong believer in helping companies and individuals discover their own path towards ethical data ownership, transparency, and use. She believes in changing the conversation on how we collect data, what is collected, and how that data is used. She currently works in the data industry and can be found on social platforms at TJ Does Data. Welcome all.
Thanks.
So I would like to start this conversation by, perhaps asking you, Senator, again, given what you've said and given what you've heard, it would be interesting, I think, to know your vision for the future of the kind of a policy innovation that is this bill. It is clear that data is going to be on policy makers' minds for a while, both here domestically and overseas. But what are the paths of developing policy around data that would benefit your community and the community at large?
That's a great question, Jonas. Like I mentioned earlier, I think there's different conversations already happening around the technology industry, or about the technology industry, about big tech specifically, about data. There is a very significant privacy conversation to be had that has a big impact on people's everyday lives and how they interact with technology that in some ways we can't live without, right? It's very hard to imagine a world now where we don't have everything on instant recall at the tip of our fingertips on our phone or in our email or any social media platform. So the privacy conversation is obviously very important. But I really think the value of what we're talking about with the data labor compensation bill is that there is also a recognition that we aren't going backwards in terms of the evolution of our digital economy. The digital economy is growing. It's here to stay. It's going to continue to evolve. It's going to continue to reshape how every other sector of our economy operates and exists. And if we don't start now thinking about how to put a harness on that, not to shut it down, but to put a rein on it to help regulate it and help make sure that whatever benefits the digital economy produce flow back to the common good, we will be in a world of trouble a generation from now. And so now is the appropriate time to think about how can we take the value of the data economy in a way and take a piece of it and regulate it in a way that we can put a return back to the general public so that we can stay ahead of the curve. There's been a lot of conversation around the issue of automation. and about the job losses that result from automation. We miss that. We as a society, as a country, we kind of turned an eye to that, and we avoided that conversation before it was. Now it's too late in some ways, right? The job losses that are brought on by automation, we can't stop that. We have a chance now, as the data economy is growing, but still, like I said, only about 7% of our GDP, to think creatively and proactively about how do we take this new sector, this new world, and regulate it in a way to make sure that the benefits that are created by that sector flow back to us. So that's why I think that thinking about data labor is really important, and thinking about data labor compensation, especially, is really important. And that's where I hope that the evolution of this conversation continues to go, not as a way to punish, but as a way to kind of think about this is the way of the future. Let's start planning proactively from now.
Yeah, that's great. A question for Tiffany Johnson. Tiffany, so based on your experience, what are the main ethical problems of a quote unquote data economy, and what are the available pathways of addressing them that you can share?
Absolutely. So excellent question. And I want to say that when we think about data ethics, right? In the world of which I work in, and I do work at one of the large companies, but we think about data ethics above and beyond compliance, right? Because we just don't have enough. We don't have really good legislation across the US. It goes state by state. So we have no federal legislation to begin with, right? So whenever we're thinking about this at a state level, I think it's incredibly important, first of all, to acknowledge that the legislation being proposed at the state level is really these guidelines and these guideposts that hopefully will lead to more legislation and more protections across the entire US. So when we think about data ethics and this ethical component, it is above and beyond compliance. But when you get into that realm, not a lot of companies are motivated to actually think about data ethics, right? There's no, I mean, we're all work at a publicly traded company, and so there's not a lot of motivation for them to say, oh, let's stop using the thing that has generated us millions and millions and millions of dollars, right? So when you think about data ethics, it's the very first, the very first issue that we have is that without proper legislation, and without really thoughtful legislation about how this could potentially work and how then there's no motivation to begin with for companies to actually tackle this, aside from we do pitch it in that it's good for business. There's a trust economy here, but that trust has largely been broken. And so when we think about then this data economy, is that the only motivation here is really trust. So if you happen to be in an industry of which you've suffered massive data breaches, or it's uncovered that you are using data in all sorts of unexpected ways that people would potentially not agree with, but you have historically always had access to that data, so you've used it, and you've done so legally. But I think that at some point it goes a little too far, and thus when consumers start to learn and they start to grow and understand how data is being collected, how it's being used, then it's very unexpected for them. And so then you come across issues of trust, this broken trust, and people wanting to feel like they have more control and more transparency over some very personal information that is bought, sold, traded every single day.
A question for Joe Toscano. In your view, what is your view in general? We're talking about $1 billion in potential revenue, but I think you as a tech entrepreneur and the industry insider, what is your view on the importance of data? Are policymakers potentially behind the technology on this, where the state of the technology is? Are they missing something? What is being missed by the public, if anything? Something we don't know, but should know about the tech industry? It's a loaded question. So what do you think?
Yeah, tell us your philosophy on data. Yes. So to begin with, we'll take it one step at a time. I do think policymakers are behind the eight ball, and that's not every one of them, but I do think the majority. And it's not. I've discussed this over and over again. I don't think it's because of ignorance, right? Like, a lot of policymakers, people don't realize how much their public officials are responsible for, how much they need to know in order to do their job, and many of them have a very wide expansive knowledge of different things going on within the economy. But this is such a new field, right? The internet itself has only really been around for 30 years ish, right? 20, 30 years, depending on when you want to really count it taking off. And not everyone has the time to keep up. Some of the representatives we have are 60, 70, 80 years old, right? Like it's a generational shift. They never were even around this. They had no reason to pick it up. Or in some cases, like where I'm from in the Midwest, people grew up without it entirely. People to this day in some places in rural America still barely have access to the internet. So how do you, if it's not impacting their lives, why do they need to become experts in it, right? So now you have people behind the eight ball. And with all due respect, I think policy should always kind of lag behind innovation, right? We don't want policy going ahead of the curve and predicting what's going to happen and trying to control the industry, right? That's not, at least in the United States, that's not how we do things. So I think what's happening right now is we're all realizing how valuable this asset is. And as Senator Bernardes has spoke about, as Shamir spoke about, everyone here has been talking about, this is something that there's no incentive for these companies to change their business model. So we need to create it somehow. And we need protections for consumers. I think one of the biggest reasons I enjoy the idea of a data tax is that actually this is a taxation with the incentive to create a disincentive system, right? So that or like it's built to create disincentives for companies to not collect as much data as possible and process as much as possible. Versus like you'll have a privacy act, which many of them I'm happy we're starting to put rights, right? We're giving people data rights and whatnot. But a lot of these acts are trying to restrict what can even be done with data. And now I do think we need those guardrails. But again, you have people who are trying to predict every little different incident. And it's very difficult, right? It's very difficult to say what is dangerous, what is not, to label this and that. Versus like a tax is kind of more of a blunt force thing that can be applied and creates a disincentive and then gives us time to think about what we actually want to regulate beyond that. Right? So I think this is a great first step. It is definitely a very large conversation, especially when we're talking about the taxation of the commercialization of data. Right? This is a whole other layer beyond advertising tax or digital revenues tax kind of thing. This is a much deeper conversation, but I'm very happy we're having it here today because it's something that needs to happen. Whether it is exactly what's been proposed in this bill or it is some kind of alternative that gets iterated on over the next year and coming decades, whatnot. I do believe that this will be in place. It's just a matter of who does it first and how it happens, I believe.
I'd love to like make a comment on that, if I may, because I agree with, I'm definitely in agreement with a lot of what of Joe's, principles and what he's talking about. And I do find it particularly interesting, the example that you give, Joe, about because you're absolutely right. Like people aren't educated on this. They don't know. They don't know what data is being collected on them. And we've seen a lot of research. Seen research coming out of Pew. We've like done internal research in my company as well. And what we've seen is that there's a lot of confusion as to like how to even start. Like they know data is being collected. They're like, oh yeah, the people are definitely collecting data on me. But what am I supposed to do about this? And so I think that it's something that trying to educate the masses is incredibly important along with this and providing that more education. And I think that having a system and a way to actually go about doing that is also fairly important. And I do say, that, but as we've also seen too, is that people do look to government to help regulate this, and they also look to companies. So I think that like there is an opportunity within government and legislation and companies to help motivate companies to follow down this path a little bit more. It's extremely important to also then to work in that way. And I think that that's kind of what consumers are looking for as well. Is this, like we've seen both sides of this. Well, we want the government to help step in, but we also have expectations of companies to do the right thing. And then I think the other thing that I thought was particularly interesting, that you were talking about too, was you were talking too a little bit more about ways I think that the data, like this tax, can be used. And I think that there's ample opportunity to start to educate people, even starting like whenever you're in grade school, right? Because your data is being collected, when your kids have cell phones, and whenever you have tablets, all of that data is also still being collected and used. So I do think that like there is ample opportunity to, when you talk about data tax, to start educating sooner rather than later as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is a very good point. But I have another question, and of course, I always have questions. If the audience has any questions, please do uh, supply them in the Q&A box, and we'll be answering them as well. Don't forget to ask your questions. But my question to Senator Gunardis is, this is a very solid proposal, in my opinion. I had something to do with it, but I think nothing is perfect. And how do you respond to potential critics and their concerns that if enacted, this bill might be unfavorable to the data-dependent innovation that we know is expanding and growing? So how would you address that?
I think it's important for us to acknowledge that criticism and to make very clear that this is not an anti-tech proposal. This is not about stopping tech. This is not about stopping innovation. This is about appropriate regulation and appropriate compensation. And so I'll give you kind of the theoretical answer and then like the practical answer. Theoretically, we accept the premise that this is about regulation and compensation, not about being anti-tech. We should look to see, and we should want to see, actors in the data economy space, paying for their fair share of what they collect from us. In any other context, we would not think it'd be okay to say, well, the railroads are a great innovation, but we think it's important that to allow them to get across the country, we're not going to pay the people that build the railroads, because it's just so important that we get a train from New York to San Francisco that we just can't afford to pay. We shouldn't have to pay the workers that actually lay the tracks. That's a preposterous argument, right? It's the same type of argument here. We're not saying that we don't want the railroad, the digital railroad of the 21st century. We're saying that if we're going to build it, if we're going to use it, we have to make sure that we are compensating people fairly and appropriately for their help in creating that infrastructure, for creating that digital railroad. I'm going to probably, tire out the metaphor in about one or two more sentences there, so I'll stop there. So that's really the theoretical response. This is not about cracking down. This is about just what is fair, what is right. We wouldn't say that a factory owner should not have to pay wages to their workers just because in the name of innovation, they can do more if they had more net revenues minus their personnel costs. We wouldn't accept that argument today. We shouldn't accept it in the digital economy space. But as a practical answer, we are mindful of that concern, especially for newer companies that are just starting out, or for smaller companies that are really not engaging in this type of behavior in any significant way. So the bill has a couple of small carve-outs. Number one, we are not capturing, the collection of data that is incidental to commercialization. So anything that's not really being commercialized, sold, marketed, chopped up, repackaged, things like that. If I input my password into my banking account on my phone, that's technically data, but we're not saying that you have to be taxed, that Chase has to be taxed because you put in your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 password, right? That's a separate thing. But if they are marketing things to you because you are a certain type of customer, or you live in a certain area, or you have certain types of financial products, that is what we're talking about. So we carve out, we have some language in the bill to say if it's incidental, really small data collection that's really not commercialized, we're not going to touch that. Secondly, if you're a small company that has small net revenues beneath $5 million a year, we're going to exempt you from the taxing requirements of the bill. And then thirdly, if you are a new startup, we are going to exempt you from the first 3 years of your startup existence to give you the runway and the space to create your unicorn, right? Everyone gets into the tech world because everyone thinks they have the idea to be the next big thing, the next Snapchat, the next Instagram, the next Facebook, the next whatever, right? We don't want to shut down those dreams on day one. We want to give innovators the runway to create their products in a way that's responsible, and then to say, look, when the time comes when you are mature enough and you are making your dream a reality, we now expect you to pay your fair share and to pay for how you are using other people's data. So I think we're striking the right balance between regulation and innovation in a way that's not going to stymie the industry, but actually help it grow.
Yeah, if I can chime in on this too, I think the other thing that gets lost, right? Everyone that I've heard that's arguing a case against taxing these companies, first of all, a lot of it's coming from big companies who know that they'd be paying a lot of money in, right? It's not coming from a lot of people, individuals who are getting raped right now. So it's often big companies who are complaining, and the reality is, like, think about it this way: if I go do research at a university, I often get compensated for my time. That might be a Starbucks gift card. It might be $25 for an hour, whatever. I usually get paid for participating in research. If I'm in a medical research study, I often will get paid thousands of dollars for a few weeks worth of work, right? Almost every other point of like research, we get compensated for in the real world. With social media, all of a sudden, our whole lives became a social study, a behavioral study, and we don't get any kind of compensation for it. Now, people will say, but this tax, it's not paying the individual, right? The money's going to the government. You have to trust the government to make these decisions and allocating the funding and everything. But the problem there is that right now, at this point in history at least, it's very hard to dissect individual value and actually point individual value to an individual. And then there's also the imbalance of, yeah, Oprah's data might be worth a lot of money, but maybe mine's not worth a lot. So is it really worth all the breakdowns, right? So what we're having here is more of a class action, if you will, right? You're creating a tax that extracts this money in a way that is getting redistributed in a fairly equal way to the public rather than paid to individuals. That doesn't mean in the future that we don't want to get people paid for their activities individually. But right now, at this point in history, one, it's really, really difficult. Two, the people don't, and even technologists don't quite know how to demand that or what that needs to come to life as. And three, we need, as Senator Bernardus has done here by proposing this, we need government officials to step up and represent us and protect us now, be the shields while we figure all this stuff out. And what this tax does is, like I said previously, it creates a disincentive structure. So at least maybe we could slow things down to think about it a little bit more, while simultaneously taking that money and redistributing it to the public in the form of public education, access to technology for kids in schools, retraining the workforce, which is desperately needed, especially in this transition through COVID where everybody's moving online. I think it's a very common sense argument. There are definitely things that need to be spoken about and fixed within it. I'm sure there are plenty of arguments to be had about it, but I think the proposal itself is very common sense, and I hope that it gains traction. I'm very excited about it.
So then a question right back at you is again, based on your experience, Joe, are there any potential pitfalls in regulating and taxing data? In other words, will the tech sector be able to adapt, even if we're talking about the large corporations in this bill, but will that environment adapt well to the new reality where this data tax exists? Based on your experience, what do you think?
Absolutely. There's always going to be pitfalls, right? If you make a decision that's going to affect hundreds of millions of people, there's going to be some slights here and there that need to be discussed and thought through. A big one, for example, if you start taxing these companies, there's the comments that, well, now all these platforms are going to have to start charging money, right? Well, Is that such a bad thing? We'll find out. We'll discuss, right? There's also arguments that us paying with our attention is creating addictions and causing a lot more problems than $2 a month would, right? So there's comments there. There's the idea that by creating this tax you'll harm innovation. Well, we did discuss that. We did think that one through. I think there's carve outs for it, but there's probably room for improvement in those arguments as well. We definitely do not want this to be something where we disincentivize companies to innovate or participate in creating new products and services. And then there's all kinds of conversations about, well, is there a different tax rate for smaller companies than there are for larger companies, et cetera, et cetera. Like there are for income tax, right now the way it's proposed there's not, but maybe in the future there is. So there are plenty of holes to be poked at, and I think that it's great to have those arguments right now. We need to be having those right now. The whole point of this is to have that conversation.
Okay, that's fair enough. So a question for Tiffany Johnson. The bill that we're talking about, of course, it advances the goals of transparency. There's a new commissioner that is being created in that bill, and technology literacy. So there's some allocation and expenditure that is included, along with the tax revenue. So with all of this done, how much work do you think is still going to be left to do to ensure the balanced outcome for the future, so that we are positioning ourselves in that data economy in the most harmless way possible?
So I think that what you've described is great. I love this idea of creating a commission specifically for this, because the data world is complicated. There's nothing easy about how data is bought, sold, traded. It is an incredibly complicated system. So I think what you've described is like the tip of an iceberg, right? So that is the beginning of what would then lead to, I think, extended work. Really, and really what I think too is that extended work in understanding the nuances of how to enforce this and also enforcing it. So I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Johnny Ryan. Johnny Ryan is a guy who has, over in the UK, has been the driving force of pursuing lawsuits against these big tech companies, specifically to understand the exact kind of data that is being collected and how it's being used within programmatic companies. And so he's been a driving force in this. And in conversations with him, we've had this conversation a few times. He's like, well, I think that legislation is great, but how do we enforce it? So I think that actually having a separate commission to help enforce it and give it some teeth will really be some of the real work that comes after this. That, and again, that nuance of understanding how data works. One of the other pieces of this that I think is incredibly interesting is the having a strategic plan for how you're using data, right? So I think right now what happens, and has historically happened, I think it's starting to shift. It's getting better. I've seen these changes in the industry over the past year or so, but it's not just collecting every piece of data that you can possibly collect, but it's actually saying, oh, we're going to collect this and here's why we're collecting it. So that way you can be more transparent and you can offer more choice because you have intention behind it. But I think it's a good question. It's just what you've described as the start of what is a lot of work that would go into enforcing this.
That's good. Okay, I would like to talk about education and where the spending side of things. Senator, where in particular would you envision the money to be going, generated by this tax, and what is a particular need that you think is going to be addressed by doing that?
Well, first of all, the tax would be collected by New York State, so it would go to New York State to administer and distribute as part of its general fund. And some of the issues that I highlighted in my introduction, really, education, digital literacy, infrastructure behind digital education. I think Joe was referencing earlier, during the pandemic, the shift to online learning, but so many of our students here in New York City alone didn't have access to reliable Wi-Fi or reliable broadband, didn't have access to devices. Some students were taking their classes on their parents' cell phones all day. It's all of those things that we can really invest in properly to really build out a proper digital educational infrastructure. Workforce development also. We alluded to the fact that technology is changing the workforce and how we do different types of work. This is a great way. Oftentimes workforce development programs are last on the priority list for funding and budgets, or they're the first to get scaled back or trimmed back, and we're never able to really scale up the types of work and the types of programs that we really think would be transformational for people, especially in an age in which there's so much churn in an economy. We can dedicate significant resources from the revenue generated here towards digital workforce development. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can think about needs that are currently being unmet, and that are being challenged specifically by the way that the data economy is allowed to go unregulated right now, and then take that money specifically to help cure those ills and fix those problems, so that we lift up everyone at the same time while putting in place the proper regulations over the entire sector of the economy as a whole.
Okay. Okay, we have about 1 minute, but 1 minute and a half maybe, and there is some activity in the Q&A box. There is a question which I would like to read. How is higher education and research done at universities impacted by the bill, or would be impacted by the bill? Is there a carve out? Will companies or universities collect the data and pay the tax and then pass it on to the students, for example? Is there an answer?
Joe gave an answer in the chat as well. He responded to it, but I'll just say, generally speaking, if the university is selling the data or commercializing the data or collecting data for non-research purposes, well, then they're not really acting in a way, for public intellectualism, right? They're doing it for a commercial purpose, which would be, subject to the taxes regulation. If they were collecting data strictly for academic research, without any commercialization effect, then I think they would not be subject to it there. But like Joe said in the chat, this is an area that we can, certainly ripe for further conversation, especially thinking about the interplay between advances made, at the university level, and then how that jumps into the commercial sector, and whether or not, developments made on campus through, tech labs and whatnot, then get privatized and then put into commercial practice. Where those lines get drawn, I think would really be appropriate for further conversation.
Excellent. So we are at time, and I would like to give an opportunity, maybe 15 seconds, the last words for all of you to address the audience, and at that point we will close. We'd like to start. 15 seconds, 30 seconds, anything to say to position us for future conversation?
Thank you. First of all, thank you guys for having me on. Really been a delightful conversation. And I think that it's an ongoing conversation about ways that we can have more effective legislation to, help regulate the data collection and kind of help balance those scales a little bit. So from my side, I just wanted to say thank you guys for having me on, and look forward to future conversations as well.
Joe?
Yeah, I think same for me. I'm very excited that this is out in public now, that we can talk about this. I know it's been internal here for since December, November last year. I think we've been talking about this. So it's just great to have it public. And for everyone who showed up and is interested, please keep interest, please share it. Please send us feedback. We're looking for feedback right now. We understand that this is an evolving thing and it needs to continue to grow. So thanks everyone for being here. Thanks y'all for having me, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Senator, you'll have the last word.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Jonas, for putting this together. Thanks, Tiffany and Joe. We really want to hear from folks about this idea. We are very excited about this. We think this has a lot of potential, not just here in New York, but to really be a trendsetter across the country and frankly across the globe. So the implications of this and the potential for this are limitless. So we'd love to hear feedback from folks. Stress test our ideas, send us questions, send us comments, and then help us advocate for this, because this is in some ways such a new conversation that it's going to be harder to explain and to get people to understand and willing to take the leap to do the right thing here. So we're going to need all of you to help us become advocates and help us sell this bill as we try to move it through the legislative process. So I'm excited about it. I think this is a great potential, great opportunity for us all collectively, and I can't wait to get working on it with you all.
Well, with that, we will end. Thank you very much, Senator, Joe, Tiffany, Shamir, and everyone who joined us. It's a great conversation to have, and we'll look forward to having more of them. Bye-bye.
Ciao.